Welcome to the Fearfully and Wonderfully Me podcast, a podcast designed to help you increase your influence, develop your leadership, and maximize your results.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast episode. Super excited about this podcast episode because this one kicks off the first in a series of podcast episodes I wanted to do on how to increase your influence in a specific situation, or how to increase your influence at the specific situation. And so today I'm just going to kick off the very first of this podcast episode series with talking about how to increase your influence at work. And I realize that not everybody listening to this podcast episodes are, working for someone else or working in an organization, but I know a lot of people are. So I wanted to talk about some very specific examples of how you can increase your influence at work, and specifically with your boss. Because here's the thing, we all want to influence other people, of course at work, of course at home, but your boss is certainly someone that you should be very concerned with increasing your influence with. Now, I realized that I couldn't begin to give you every single scenario for how to increase your influence with your boss or at work, but I wanted to give some concrete examples or scenarios. And what I would encourage you to do is take the principle, because even if you don't experience that exact situation or scenario, or this doesn't exactly fit your situation, you can take the principle of how to increase your influence with your boss or at work and apply it to your situation, right? Mac and I always talk about, don't really worry about the practices, because practices are things that we do. They're kind of like, the actions, and those can be powerful, but you're not going to be able to always apply that specific practice in a different situation. And that's why it's important to look for the principle. So I can give you some examples, but there again, I want to just encourage you to look for the principle behind the scenario and apply that to your situation, because that will work every time. Principles are like gravity. Gravity is a principle. It always applies. Even if you don't know what gravity is, or you don't know how to talk about gravity, if you step off the roof of the building, gravity is going to apply. Gravity is a principle, right? It's always going to apply. And so when it comes to leadership and influence, it's really helpful to look for the principles. A lot of times we can get caught up in the practices, and then it doesn't work in a specific situation, because people are different, people are dynamic. And so very important to look for the leadership principles of influence, instead of just the actual practice. For example, if you have always heard that the best way to greet somebody is, a really firm handshake, and that's a practice, right? A handshake is a practice we do. Now, the principle is you're trying to make a connection when you meet somebody, but the practice is actually reaching out and giving someone a nice, firm handshake. But in some cultures, reaching out and giving someone a nice, firm handshake is not appropriate or polite when you first meet somebody. And so the practice, when you first meet somebody in a different culture who doesn't introduce themselves like that, would not serve you well. The practice doesn't always apply. The principle, trying to make a connection, always would. And if you're truly trying to make a connection with someone when you meet them in a different culture, you would probably Google how to connect with them, or how to introduce yourself, and what's an appropriate way to make that connection in their culture. For example, a lot of the Asian cultures don't necessarily shake hands, but might, have a little nod, or even a bow, right? Just a different form of how they make a connection with someone when they introduce themselves, or when they are introduced to someone. So that's just a little example of how we should always look for the underlying principle and not just get caught up on the practice. Another thing is, I see this a lot where, I meet somebody at a conference, or Mac and I are there to speak, and, we're introduced to someone, maybe the facilitator of the conference, or somebody on the board of the association of the conference that brought us in to speak. And it's interesting because a lot of times in a professional environment, men aren't always sure whether they should automatically reach out and offer to shake a female's hand. And so, the principle there is they're not sure, should I just take the practice of going through with a handshake, right? Not all women are comfortable shaking hands. And maybe if you're some women that I've known, or maybe you've experienced this, that you've gotten your hand absolutely crushed by someone who has a very, very firm handshake. And so you don't want to necessarily shake hands, and that's okay. But a lot of times men in that environment aren't certain whether they should go forward with trying to shake hands or not. And so I recognize that. And the principle there between trying to connect with someone is I usually just make that person at ease right away. Like I just go in and offer to shake hands so that they don't have to worry about should they or shouldn't they, or are they going to offend me, or, just try to make them comfortable. If I feel like they're kind of on the verge of should I reach out, should I not, to shake hands, then I just go ahead and extend my hand so that they don't have to second guess that, right? I'm trying to make that connection easy for them. But there again, just an example of how the practice doesn't always help us. So talking about how to increase your influence with your boss at work specifically, the best way that I can do this, and Mac and I talk about this a lot, we talk about it a little bit differently, but I always say when you're trying to increase your influence with your boss, go the extra inch. Go the extra inch, because there are a lot of people at work who are only going to do what they have to do. A lot of people at work are just content to coast. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because most people are busy at work. I have absolutely no doubt. Someone who's not willing to go the extra inch probably has a lot of things to do. They get a lot of emails, there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of things going on. And so they already feel like they're, maxed out just doing the things that they're supposed to do. And so they don't feel like they want to take on any additional responsibilities. Mac always says, if you want to move forward or increase your influence with your boss, don't ask for a raise, ask for responsibility. Go the extra inch. That's how I like to say that, because going the extra inch is going to take you the extra mile when it comes to increasing your influence. Because even if you're busy, even if you have a lot of tasks on your plate, if you go to your boss and you say, let me take ownership of something that would help make your life easier, right? If you're going the extra inch by taking on another project or taking on something that's burdening them that you can just take care of, that's going to increase your influence. I love the story of Jimmy Collins. And if you're not familiar with him, he was Truett Cathy's third employee when Truett Cathy was starting up back in the 1960s. And Jimmy was with Truett until he retired, I think in 2001. So after 33 years of service. And a lot of people don't know who Jimmy Collins is, but he's got a great book called Creative Followership. And he talks about following the leader, right? Following the boss, if you will. And he talks about his perspectives and his stories of following Truett Cathy. Most people know Truett Cathy as the founder of Chick-fil-A, but not a lot of people know that Jimmy Collins was, as he says it, he tells the story, he says, I always said that I want to do all of the things that Truett Cathy doesn't want to do, right? And Truett Cathy would come back and say, I don't want to do much. So Jimmy Collins did a lot of the things that helped build Chick-fil-A. But that's an example of he was living that same principle, right? Going the extra inch, because he would say, do the things that your boss doesn't want to do. If you want to increase your influence with your boss, do the things that your boss doesn't want to do. It just makes sense. If I'm the boss and I don't like to do a specific thing, then if you do that thing for me, I'm going to like you better for it. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about leadership and influence, it always has to be in the context of not trying to manipulate somebody, right? You're not trying to increase your influence with the boss just so you can manipulate them into giving you a better schedule or more money. It has to be truly because you're value driven and you're just saying, I'm going to take ownership of this. I'm going to take responsibility for this, because you already know this. People can feel your intentions. And if they feel like you're trying to manipulate them, that is never, ever, ever going to increase your influence, because that's going to destroy trust in the relationship. And so it truly has to be from a place of saying, you know what, let me make your life easier because I value just being able to take ownership of that and a responsibility. Now, the upside of that every time you take on some responsibility, and maybe it's a project or leading a task force or leading a team to tackle a project, you're going to get experience from that. And experience is something that makes you more valuable. It might be in the long term, but experience is always going to make you more valuable. And when you become more valuable, you have more value in the workplace. Maybe at that organization, maybe at a different organization, and that's okay, right? Sometimes the experience that we earn is going to help us in a future role, and that's okay. What I want you to do is be intentional about going the extra inch. And I remember this has played out so many times throughout my career, even through my experience now. But I remember specifically sitting down. It was our department, our divisions meeting. So it wasn't just my department, but it was my boss and me, and then a couple of the other managers that were in our division, and we all reported to the same boss, if you will, the same supervisor, manager. And we were sitting in this meeting, and she had something that had come up that our division clearly needed to take ownership of. And so she was asking the three of us managers who wanted to take ownership of this, right? Who was willing to step up and go the extra inch and say, I'll take care of this for you. And I remember just having that clear thought of saying, I want this. I want to take ownership of this responsibility. And I remember like everybody else was looking at me like, you're just going to volunteer to take on this project. Like we were all sitting around, and I think everyone else was thinking she was going to just say, tap one of us on the shoulder and say, here, have this. And before she got to that point, I'm like, hey, I want to take ownership of this project. And I knew it was going to require me to do, more stuff. It was more in depth. It certainly was more in depth than I realized on the front end. But I learned such an incredible amount about the process and about the project itself. And that was knowledge that I could use later on in so many different avenues. But it increased my influence with her because she had this thing that she needed somebody to do. And I'm the first one to say, hey, I'll take ownership of that. I'll take that off of your plate. I'll go that extra inch in this example. And it really did help increase my influence with her, because she knew, number one, I would take ownership and take that responsibility. But number two, and she didn't know this on the front end, but she knew she could count on me. If I committed to take ownership of something, she knew she could count on me to get that done. Now, she didn't know that on the front end, right? That only happened after I took ownership of the project and saw it through to completion. And that's the second part. When you go the extra inch, you absolutely 100% have to follow through on keeping your commitments to your boss. If you say you will meet a deadline, you absolutely have to meet that deadline, because when you make a commitment to get something done at a certain time, you're building trust and influence. But if you don't get it done when you say you're going to get it done, you are decreasing your trust and influence in that scenario. So that's kind of a twofold thing, right? Go the extra inch. But when you do, you absolutely have to take ownership of keeping to the commitments that you commit to. And that will play out in so many different ways. But when it particularly comes to your boss, if you're committing to a project and a deadline, and you see that the deadline is approaching, and for whatever reason you are drowning and you can't do it and you need extra help, you have to be clear in communicating that. But really, before you even go to that point, try not to make a commitment if you can't keep it, right? Because that's the best way to build your influence at work with your boss, making a commitment and keeping it. If you make a commitment and you see that you're maybe not going to be able to commitment, then maybe to keep that commitment, then maybe the best thing you can do after that scenario is communicate that clearly and go, okay, here's what's happening, here's why it's happening, what can I do, here's where I need to take responsibility for making this the best outcome. But that's not going to help your trust and influence increase by a lot, right? And probably going to decrease it in some ways, but your boss will know that they can count on you to communicate, so that will help with your influence there. But you're going to be losing some influence because they know that you made a commitment that you couldn't keep. And so the next time you make a commitment, they're going to be thinking, I might not can trust you to follow through on that. So be very careful about the commitments that you make. And I think this applies to a lot of dimensions of life, but specifically talking about how to increase your influence with your boss at work. Go the extra inch. Absolutely take ownership, ask for the extra projects and the extra experience, because that's going to make you more valuable there or somewhere else. It's interesting now in what Mac and I do, how much of the skills that I learned in previous jobs have helped me be successful in the things that I do now. Learning how to master Excel spreadsheets early on in my career, it helped a little bit in my career, certainly having that technical knowledge, but the skills that I learned in working in Excel and Microsoft Word are so important now today. And, as an entrepreneur, and we own our own business, and how many times I need to work in Microsoft Word or Excel spreadsheets. And I can, I'm really comfortable in those programs because I asked for extra responsibility early on in my career and said, I'll take ownership of that. And with that, I had to learn a computer program. But guess what? Now I know that, and that's knowledge I can put to use later. And so you see how all of that plays out. It absolutely is a long-term game, right? When you take ownership of something, go the extra inch, you're in it for the long game. You're looking to increase your influence with your boss at work, but you're also saying, this experience is going to help me grow in some way. And there again, being cautious to say, once I take ownership and I make a commitment to see this project through, I need to be very conscious of following through on those commitments. But those two things will take you a long, long way in your career. How to build your influence with your boss at work, go the extra mile, and then follow through every time you do. I promise you that will help you increase your influence. Until next time.
Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.